on personally because I am fighting for this country.
Today we're actually all meeting up and we're going to canvass some neighborhoods.
We come in the morning, we grab our bags, we get all of the promotional materials that we're going to hand out, so the door hangers, we're going to get our iPads.
We're checking out iPads, which contain technology with the house information.
We're deploying the latest technology in canvassing.
That maps it all out, takes you right to the door. It's wonderful.
Once we get our iPads, we split up into our teams and we go out to our neighborhoods and we knock on the door, ring the doorbell.
It's pretty exciting. We get up to each door, we're very well received. A lot of people are thanking us. Hey, thank you for doing this. It's very important.
It's just nice that there are people out here who are willing to put in the work, that are willing to hit the pavement.
It's getting a little scary, the atmosphere that our government is getting us into.
The people do better with their money than a government could ever possibly do.
If you've got a government big enough to solve everything for you, they can take everything from you, and that's a problem.
We need to make sure that our country keeps going in a positive direction of limited government and economic freedom, and that's basically what I'm fighting for.
I get to help my community and to better my community.
You know, America's still alive.
I really do want to make a difference.
I'm kicking and screaming and I'm doing everything I can do to fight for our freedoms.
We have to get Americans to believe in themselves again, to take control of their lives, to give back to the community on their own.
It's an awesome, humbling experience. You really feel like you're in control of your future.
Things aren't going to change if we don't get involved.
We have to educate people on how they can be.
If we don't, who will?
It really just inspires all of us to keep on doing what we're doing.
The grassroots effort that we're putting in is an effort that everyone should try and strive for.
If we want a good country, it takes work.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mark Lucas, Americans for Prosperity.
Good evening, thank you, and welcome to our Road to Reform event with Senator Marco Rubio. This event is hosted by Americans for Prosperity and is being live streamed all around the world on our website, roadtoreform.org. If you'd like to participate in the social media discussion, follow us on Twitter @AFPHQ and use the hashtag #2reform. The thing I love about that video is that the people being interviewed were just everyday, ordinary, hardworking Americans. People who care about this country and want to fight for the future of this nation. AFP consists of activists that have gone through a whole host of things in life. Some of them have lost their job in this tough economy. Some of them have had health care plans canceled. Some of them are grandparents that just want to work for their grandchildren's future. For me, my fight started in Afghanistan in 2010. I was able to serve as an Army Ranger along the Afghan-Pakistani border. And when I came home in 2011, I came back to a country that was really in disarray. And I wanted to rededicate my service to the future of this country. One of the things I love about working for Americans for Prosperity is that it gives me the tools to really make policy changes that affect everyday people's lives. And if you see in that video, our activists were able to use our technology, AFP's iPads, our state-of-the-art phone system, to be able to make change and lobby their legislators and lobby their fellow citizens to take action to really change the course of this country. Tonight we get an opportunity to talk about a very important issue. And what I hope that we accomplish tonight is that we're able to educate you on the Export-Import Bank. So you're able to take that knowledge from here and activate and persuade your local legislators to let the Export-Import Bank expire. Now, before I bring up our hosts or guests tonight, I want to introduce a quick video from a partner of ours from Heritage that will give us more background on the Export-Import Bank before we get into a deeper conversation with Senator Rubio. Enjoy.
Diane Katz. I'm with the Heritage Foundation. One of the things that I've been working on for the past year and a half has been a rather obscure agency called the Export-Import Bank. Now what this bank does is that it gives away taxpayer money to foreign firms so that they can buy U.S. products, which might sound good in theory. It was developed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 30s, and in the 80 or so years since, it has grown into a huge pot of cronyism and corporate welfare. This is one of those instances in which Congress doesn't have to do anything to do the right thing, to do away with the cronyism, the corporate welfare, and all the other things that breed favoritism for some and opportunity for too few. As a government agency, the officials of the Export-Import Bank are not using their own money to finance these deals, and they therefore have less accountability than you would find in the private sector. Consequently, it shouldn't surprise us that there have been a number of cases of corruption and that are now being investigated at the bank. And recently, one of the bank employees was found guilty of taking kickbacks for arranging loans. And when you have officials who are giving away taxpayers' money and who are not accountable for that money, this is kind of a breeding ground for that kind of corruption. There are a number of members of Congress out there who think that we can reform the bank and keep it open and everything will be okay. The problem is that by its very nature, XM is distortionary to the economy, and as I said earlier, it is also a breeding ground for corruption. They have tried reforms in the past, but what we've seen is that reform doesn't get to the heart of the problem. And the heart of the problem is that when you have the government subsidizing a very small but powerful group of corporations, that's a form of cronyism. They're getting special favors. But even if the bank ran perfectly, let's say it never had a default, there was no corruption, no one was hurt, the economy wasn't distorted, the fact remains it is not government's role to be the financier in a free enterprise system, and it's time to let the bank go.
Well, before I introduce Senator Rubio, I just want to let you know that he's one of the greatest champions that we have in the United States Senate, especially for Americans for Prosperity. We have a legislative scorecard. He's got a 100% score because he votes right on health care, on spending, on taxes, and regulation. And he's helping us lead the charge to let the Export-Import Bank expire. So please join me in welcoming Senator Marco Rubio. Well, sir, thanks for joining us, and welcome back to New Hampshire. You had a pretty busy day today. Yeah.
Big and comfortable. I might take a nap.
Well, we'll start off with our first question. When I first heard of XM, I didn't know why AFP wanted to talk about satellite radio. And several of us didn't really understand the issue. It was a very obscure issue. But in the last couple of years, it's really become a defining issue, almost a litmus test for conservatives. Can you explain to us why you think this issue has gained just so much prominence?
Well, I mean, groups like Heritage and yourself have called attention to its existence. It is obscure. You don't hear a lot of conversation about it, and it certainly isn't a topic of conversation in the news or in the newspapers, and people don't know that it's there. And so every time it comes up for reauthorization or there's a debate about it, it's kind of gone under the radar. And only in the last couple of years, as outside groups have paid attention, not just to its existence, but how it's actually working, has it risen to a level of consciousness for the political realm. And so I think that's really what's driven it, is the fact that groups like AFP and others have made it a priority to inform Americans about it.
One of our key arguments against extending the XM Bank was that it's just filled with cronyism, with corruption.
Your mic went out.
Yep, here we go.
It's a plot.
Got me now.
There's a handheld there.
Got me? Perfect. Rangers always have a backup plan. One of our key arguments against XM was the fact that there's a lot of kickbacks. A lot of people have been convicted for accepting bribes, getting lavish trips paid for by companies that want XM to be extended. What do you think of this pay-for-play type of culture, and how can we make that disappear?
So it's an inevitable conclusion to how this works, because you have this enormous pot of money. People don't know a lot about it. It's not subject to heavy congressional or media scrutiny. And you have individuals that are making decisions that move hundreds of millions of dollars potentially into the hand of one venture or one firm versus another. And hence you create the potential for this to happen. And I think that's why you've seen them. It's a tremendous amount of power. Imagine being someone in a position who, by making a certain determination, increase the likelihood that this company gets a loan or versus that company. And so ultimately you're going to have cases where people are being feted and people are being courted and people are being reached out to in the hopes of influencing them to award something of this nature. And again, it's not getting a lot of attention. There's no one watching it daily in the past. And the result is the culture's built up where these sorts of cases happen. And so it's not surprising that it reaches this point.
And you kind of mentioned there's companies that are pitted against each other. For instance, Boeing absolutely loves the XM Bank, but Delta Airlines doesn't like it.
Right.
And the government's trying to pick winners and losers, and we've seen that work extremely well with companies like Solyndra, who went bankrupt.
Right.
How do we get rid of this culture in DC? And this is greater than just XM.
Right.
But this culture where the big and the powerful people who have the lobbyists, who have the money, are able to succeed when normal people like my parents on Main Street aren't feeling those
So
things.
think about it this way. There's this argument out there, right? And that you see a lot of people talk about it. It indicates this perception that big government is good for the people who are trying to make it, because big government is going to step in and help things be fair. That's kind of the argument the left makes. That's a popular argument that many people have. The opposite is actually true. So the more a government dominates the economy, the more a government is involved in daily life, the more the people who have the power to influence government win. So you see this all the time, for example, where established industries, an established industry will use their access to government to create rules and regulations that make it harder for a startup competitor to enter that industry. This happens at the local and state level. Uber, the fight over Uber, and if you're familiar with this car share service, in local communities across the country has largely been a fight, like where I live in Miami, between the owners of the taxi cab medallions, who have been playing politics for years, and a small startup that up to recently didn't have anybody representing them. And the result is that they're able to convince local governments not to allow a competitor to enter the space of giving people rides for a profit. You see that also manifests itself. And that's why if you look around the world, in the countries where the government dominates the economy, it's the same families and the same companies that dominate decade after decade. In the countries where there is real free enterprise and an open economy, and where government plays its role but doesn't try to determine the outcome of the economy, that's where you get entrepreneurship. That is where someone could literally, after being an employee, quit, take their life savings, open up a competitor, and one day put their former boss out of business because they're better at it than their former bosses. And that's the sort of society we should always aspire to be, a country where anyone from anywhere can achieve anything without having to hire an army of lawyers to find loopholes and lobbyists to create them.
You come from an amazing family with the American dream type of a story. And talk about how your parents were able to really experience the American dream and lift themselves up compared to the environment today with young people who are trying to make ends meet.
Well, first of all, my parents lived in the American century. The 20th century was the American century, where there were plenty of good jobs for people like them who had a limited education and otherwise couldn't get ahead, except for the fact that there were jobs for a bartender and a maid. And those jobs paid enough for them to buy a home, raise a family, retire with dignity, and leave all four of their children better off than themselves. That was the American century, and it's a phenomenal experience that we had. Today in the 21st century, the world has changed. First of all, we are less competitive every year globally. We are competing with other countries now. In the 20th century, there was just half the world was communist, and many of the other countries were still trying to recover from World War II well into the 70s and early part of the 80s. Now there are dozens of countries around the world who are reducing taxes, regulations, and the burden of government because they want to attract business, capital, and job creation to their country. We have to compete against them. And every year that goes by, as we grow government, as we grow the regulatory burden, as we make it more expensive to do business here through taxes, as we wipe out community banking through things like Dodd-Frank, it gets harder and harder for us to compete against these other nations. That hurts people like my parents who are trying to make it. The other challenge that we have is that higher education in America today is basically a monopoly. The only way you can get a degree in America today is go to an established, traditional, brick-and-mortar, four-year college or university. Meanwhile, we no longer produce enough welders, electricians, people that work with their hands. These are good-paying jobs. Not only have we stigmatized it, we've told every kid in America, you must go to a four-year university or you're not successful. We have schools that are increasing tuition every single year and graduating kids with a mountain of student loans and degrees that do not lead to jobs. How many Roman philosophers do we need? How many, and yet people are, and yet they're borrowing money to pay for these things, and there's no competition. We need more competition in higher education because the better paying jobs of the 21st century require skills, and we should open up higher education to innovative new providers that can teach online, on nights, on weekends, that give you a degree based on what you know, not how many hours you spent sitting in a classroom, oftentimes to learn things you already learned through work experience or military experience. But ultimately, here's why it was possible. My parents were successful because of free enterprise, and let me tell you what I mean by that. It is the only economic model in the history of the world where you can be better off without having to make someone else worse off. And that's why I fell in love with free enterprise, and why my parents instinctively understood free enterprise was so special. Because in order for them to make less money, their boss did not have to be worse off. What they relied on was a growing and vibrant economy where people could afford to come to Miami Beach and stay at the hotel my dad worked at, and where people like the people that own that hotel had the confidence in the future to invest that money to open up that business. Free enterprise makes it possible for you to get ahead without pulling someone else back. It's the only economic model in the world that could do that, and it's why America has been so special and why the American dream was possible for my family.
You know, we're seeing that everyday hardworking Americans are working longer hours every week. As Joe Biden said, the middle class was being crushed with our...
under this president, yeah.
Yeah, under this president. And with the increased taxes for families, but also such a high corporate tax for businesses, America's got a serious tax problem for us to remain competitive. What is your plan for tax?
So imagine if we went into a game of basketball against another country and we told our players, here's the deal. You can only shoot with your left hand. You can only, you can only shoot three-pointers. Well, that's what we do to our economy. We basically are telling our economy, you have to compete with the rest of the world, but we're going to tax you more than the rest of the world, we're going to regulate you more than the rest of the world, and our political leaders are going to demonize you if you're successful. And so yes, it's become harder than ever to succeed, and that has reached an impact in the middle class. So today, over 2 out of 3 Americans make less money today than they did in the year 2002. Meanwhile, everything costs more. And the impact is being felt because we're not creating enough better paying jobs in America, because we are losing increasingly the global competition, because our government has made it more expensive, more burdensome, and more time consuming to grow here than in another place. And then you add to that, another deep, important part of the backbone of our economy is small business, the ability to start your own business. In many cases, out of the spare bedroom of your home, or using the free Wi-Fi at Starbucks or McDonald's. You know how hard that's gotten? Because if you're using the spare bedroom over your home, not only are you in violation of the zoning code, but you can't hire an army of lawyers to help you pull the 12 permits. And the other thing that you can't have access to anymore is the small community banks that once used to lend money. You would go into a small bank and say, I'm so-and-so, here's my business plan, and you could get a loan to start up a business. The small banks are being wiped out. 40% of them have either gone under or been bought by a big bank because of regulations that come out of Dodd-Frank. These things have been destructive to upward mobility in America. Proof positive that big government crushes the people who are trying to make it.
Another tax issue that we're seeing all across the country are gas tax increases. There's been a host of state legislators that have been trying to raise the gas tax. They're claiming that there's crumbling roads and bridges. AFP was successfully able to defeat a gas tax increase in South Carolina last week. But there's been some increased talk that maybe at the federal level, there could be a
proposed gas tax increase. What's your stance on that?
Yeah, I oppose it. I will continue to oppose it. And more than oppose it, I've joined up with Mike Lee's bill that would actually devolve it back to local control on how we fund that. Look, I believe in American infrastructure, and I think we can find innovative ways to solve that at local and state level. I don't think raising the gas tax is the appropriate way to fund it, primarily because the consumer is going to feel it heavily at a time when everything else in America costs more. I mean, if you think about it, we have stagnant wages and a rising cost of living. That's why you have millions of hardworking people that a decade ago were able to save money. Now they live paycheck to paycheck. And we're only going to add to that burden, not to mention the impact it's going to have. You know, when you raise the gas tax, the increased cost is embedded in the price of everything, because everything you buy has been transported from somewhere to where you buy it. And that price has got to be passed through. Businesses have to pass through costs, so or they can't stay in business. So if you raise the gas tax, you raise the cost of transportation, it will increase the cost of everything from food to clothing to everything, electronics and everything in between.
To go further on the gas tax, you're a state legislator, and a lot of these state legislators will say that if we don't raise the gas tax, that means we've got to divert money from education or entitlement programs. How did you, as a state legislator, make those right priorities? Because it seems like infrastructure should be one of the fundamental roles of government.
Well, so ultimately what you want to do is have economic policies that allow your state to grow as fast as possible. Florida is a sales tax state. The more our economy grew, the more revenue we generated. Not because we raised taxes, but because we had more taxpayers. People were buying more. And then you can prioritize that revenue to fund the essential needs of your government. Ultimately, that also, especially at the state level, it requires you to be strong in your prioritization about where you put your money versus somewhere else. So I think that, especially most states have balanced budget amendments like Florida did. We couldn't go out and borrow the money. And so every single year we had to prioritize where we spent our money. And it is true, everybody didn't get what they wanted, but usually everybody got what they needed. And in essence, because it forced us to make difficult choices, sometimes politically unpopular, to ensure that our government lived within its means. And if you need more money for any of these things, then what you need to do is grow your economy so that it produces more revenue. At the federal level, we can also increase government revenue, but we can increase it through more taxpayers, not through more taxes. Dynamically grow your economy. You can do that by lowering rates, and it will allow you to have more funding available to do essential things like provide for the national defense, first and foremost, which is the primary obligation of the federal government. But what it has proven time and again is that when you raise the tax burden on an economy, you actually shrink economic activity and you end up costing yourself not just the ability to fund government's essential services, but millions of jobs in the process.
Let's talk about mandatory spending on entitlements. I got some statistics here that show that more than 60 million Americans are on Medicaid, almost 50 million people are on food stamps, and in fact now mandatory spending now exceeds annual budget for national defense. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between the mandatory spending and discretionary spending and this trend towards more and more entitlement spending, and how would you rein both of them in?
Well, first of all, we do no doubt have to have more efficiency in how we spend what they call discretionary spending, which is what you decide every year how much, you can decide how much to spend on or not. It's not something that is guaranteed by law. And certainly we need to become more efficient, improve defense contracting. Make sure that there isn't and reform our safety net programs. I've talked about our anti-poverty programs do not work. Our anti-poverty programs, they treat the symptoms of poverty. They do not cure poverty. I believe that if you're on government benefits in America designed to cure poverty, we need to help cure poverty by helping you, basically requiring you to either go to school or work so you can get a good paying job and never rely on the government again. These are important reforms we need to make. But the true driver of our spending and our long-term debt is the way Social Security and Medicare are currently structured. My mother is on Social Security or Medicare. I would never do anything to harm my mother. But here's the bottom line. Those programs are going bankrupt. They are spending more money every year than they take in as currently structured. What that will require is my generation of Americans to accept that our Social Security and Medicare will have to be different and work differently than our parents did, or it won't exist at all. And in essence, we will face a debt crisis sooner rather than later. If the interest on America's debt just goes up to a normal historical average, the interest payments alone on the debt would dwarf defense spending very soon. And so I do think it's important for my generation and people like me and younger to say, we understand that we're going to have to retire a year later than our parents did. that our Social Security benefits aren't going to grow as fast as our parents grew. That when it comes to Medicare, we may in fact be given, we'll have the option of either staying in traditional Medicare or going out and using our Medicare money to buy a plan in the private marketplace. We're going to have to do that. My argument is the sooner we do it, the less disruptive it's going to be, and the sooner we can address the very serious problem of a growing national debt that today is over $18 trillion and basically is equal to the size of our economy, which is an unacceptable percentage.
You know, one of the things I thought about when I came home from Afghanistan was our national debt. In my opinion, I think our debt is our greatest national security threat. So how do we address this problem when we have politicians for generations, both Republicans and Democrats, who have promised things and made promises over promises just to get reelected? How do we, find the courage to attack this national debt problem?
It begins by having, it's not even courage, by having the honesty and the decency to tell the American people, listen, anyone who's telling you that Medicare and Social Security can continue to work exactly the way it is forever is lying to you. Social Security and Medicare will not exist for my generation if it continues on the road it's on right now. That's just a mathematical fact. It's not a theory. And so the sooner we address it, the better off we're going to be. And look, I was elected to the U.S. Senate in Florida. There are a lot of people in Florida on Social Security and Medicare. But as their elected representative, I had an obligation both in that campaign and as their U.S. Senator to be truthful with them. Anyone who's in favor of leaving those programs the way they are forever is in favor of bankrupting them and bankrupting our country. We need to reform these programs. It is not a question of if, it is a question of when we have a debt crisis. When the moment comes that the yield on the bonds, the interest on the debt goes up to historical average. When the moment comes that our creditors around the world start demanding from us higher payments, and in fact some of them stop buying our debt because they lose confidence in our ability to repay it, then you're going to see outrageous increases in taxes, draconian reductions in services, draconian cuts to defense spending, all of which will trigger even an additional crisis in our economy. There will be a debt crisis if we do not address it. And I honestly believe, and I think the facts bear this out, that the next president of the United States will not be able to serve 2 full terms without spending political capital to address this reality.
Let's look at another demographic. No, absolutely, go ahead.
Otherwise, things are going well. I mean, that's
Another demographic, you talked about how Social Security won't be there for us. And especially when you look at the younger generation of kids who are graduating college, they're entering a really tough job market.
Right.
What's the future path for them? How do we build an economy that can improve employment for these young people to give them
Well, first of all, let's describe even deeper what they're facing. You have thousands of young people in America that have a mountain of student loan debt. I had over $100,000 in student loans. Okay. We have young Americans with thousands of dollars in student loan debt that they used for a degree that did not lead to a job. And that is problematic. Why? I'll tell you why. When you have a mountain of student loan debt, you can't buy a house, you can't start a business, you don't get married, or you get married later, you can't start a family, all of which have negative impacts on society, not to mention on these individuals that are facing all these restrictions. So what's the best solution out of it? First of all, let's just say that moving forward, we're not going to keep doing this to people. I believe that before you take out a student loan, you have a right to know how much people make when they graduate with that degree from your school. So you can decide whether or not you want to major in Greek philosophy or in some other profession. You have every right to do it, but you deserve to know what your job prospects are before you borrow money to pay for it. Second, we need to give current and future students more options, because there are ways today of learning that don't cost as much money. And you should get credit for what you already know. If you've been working for 10 years in the private sector, but you don't have a degree, you should get college credit for what you already know. Don't make me sit in a classroom and pay you to be taught something I already know. Give them credit for what they know and allow them to learn the rest from a variety of different sources. Maybe some community college courses, packaged with some free online courses, packaged with some unpaid internships somewhere. The point is, create some competition to traditional higher education, which today is basically a monopoly. The only people in America, or the only institutions in America, that can award what we recognize as a degree is an accredited college. And guess who controls the accrediting board? The accredited colleges themselves. And so they're not allowing any competition into higher education. And as a result, they can keep raising tuition. You raise student loans or you increase student aid, they raise their tuition to match it. Also, they can have the newest pool, the nicest recreational buildings, and hire more administrators for their higher education programs. That's unacceptable. The second point, we need to have a vibrant economy that creates the kinds of jobs that people went to school for. In this global economy where we are only 4 or 5% of the world's population, we have to be able to be competitive. And meaning that the best jobs of the 21st century pay more than the best jobs of the 20th century. But a lot of them are not being created here today because we've made it so hard to go into business here. I mean, people want to be in America. We have the best workers in the world. We're the best brand in the world. But not if your tax rate is twice as high as somewhere else. Not if labor unions are able to come in and disrupt your operations. Not if the regulatory code requires you to hire so many lawyers and regulated compliance people that make any profit. And increasingly, that's what we're doing. And so these jobs are not being created for our young people.
Let's talk about overregulation. We're hearing more and more of the power of the EPA, the power of the IRS, unelected bureaucrats who are making major decisions for this country. How do we rein in this regulatory beast so we put government back to work for the people?
Well, first of all, let's understand that a lot of these regulations that are going on, a lot of the laws that pass in Congress are nothing but authorization for agencies to write rules. So Obamacare is a perfect example. They pass Obamacare before I get there. But what Obamacare basically did is order the agencies to write a bunch of rules about how Obamacare is going to be implemented. And the same has been true with Dodd-Frank. And the same has been true for every other major piece of legislation. That's for starters. Then you have a president that's basically decided, if I can't achieve it through the legislative branch, if I can't get a bill passed, I will do it through either executive order or I will do it by getting my agencies to do it for me. So you have, for example, like this waters of the United States issue, where basically the EPA is arguing we have jurisdiction over virtually every waterway in America and that we can get our claws on. So how do you limit this? There's a lot of different ways to do it. One of the things I've tried to develop is something called a regulatory budget. Here's what a regulatory budget would mean. Every year, the federal government, through Congress, would have to set an amount, a cap, on how much regulations can cost our economy. And it will force the agencies to reduce regulations to get under that cap. So it's estimated that this year, regulations cost our economy a little bit over $1.7, $1.8 trillion of regulatory compliance costs. So Congress would come in and say, next year you can only cost half that, or something like that. Agencies would now have to reduce $800 billion of regulatory impact. And that will force them to do one thing that's really important, a cost-benefit analysis, which doesn't happen today. How much does this regulation help? And how many jobs will this regulation wipe out? I'm not saying it's the perfect approach. If there's a better one, I'll be all for that one. But we have to get this under control. It is destroying jobs. It's making us uncompetitive. And oftentimes these regulations are being written by people that are regulating industries they have never worked in, have no understanding of.
And to go along with regulations, move to energy. And it seems like we're leaving a lot of opportunity on the table to expand to new resources of energy, especially with the Keystone XL pipeline, which seems like a no-brainer for the American people, but that this administration just cannot figure out. What can we do to make America more competitive in the energy sector and to be able to grow more of the energy here in America?
Well, the great news is the private sector is doing as much as it can despite the government. I think we need to improve the way that we can transmit energy. For example, whether it's natural gas or oil, be able to get it from the fields where it's being accessed to the point of use, making it easier. The private sector will build that infrastructure, but they have to sometimes go across multiple states to do it. It's become increasingly difficult. I wrote in my book, American Dreams, now available, well, not yet available on paperback. It's a joke I was using soon. But I talked about a pipeline they're trying to build into Florida, and I wrote that they had to pull 6 different permits to build that pipeline. And PolitiFact said I was wrong. It's not 6, it's 7. That's how complicated it's become to do these sorts of things. The other is open up more federal lands to lease rights so that we can fully access all of our energy resources. And the impact of energy isn't just energy security. That's certainly a big part of it. But here's the other impact of energy security. It will help manufacturing return to America. Because the cost of energy is a big part of the manufacturing cost. It's bigger than the labor costs. If you could provide a stable, affordable source of energy, you will see a manufacturing renaissance in America, not to mention the impact it will have on the cost of living of millions of Americans who cannot afford, in many cases, to pay an additional $50 a month in their electric bill to make some radical environmentalists in California happy. And so that is an important thing.
What's the holdup for us drilling on federal lands? How can we drive through that barrier? It seems it's been discussed for a long time.
At this point, you just have a president that's resistant to it. I mean, he's obviously, there are groups that are pressuring him not to be in favor of these sorts of things. You saw what they did with Keystone, which is a no-brainer. Look, the rest of the world scratches their head. And they say to themselves, if we were the country that all of a sudden found this extraordinary supply of oil and natural gas, we would be all over it. We don't understand why America's not doing it, but we would be all over it. This is truly a game-changing development, an incredible blessing. We have gone from the thought that we had entered an era of scarcity to an era where America can literally lead the world for the rest of our lives and the rest of our children's lives in the production of oil and natural gas. What that means geopolitically is extraordinary. What that means economically is even more extraordinary. This is one of the cornerstones of us being able to have a 21st century that's even better than the 20th century. And I'll tell you, if we don't do it, historians 100 years from now will write, what were they thinking?
Let's move on to healthcare. Today was there's a pretty significant Supreme Court ruling. Wanted to get your read on that ruling and what you think the path forward is.
Well, it's disappointing. It's very disappointing. I think they're wrong, unfortunately. But the bottom line is, whether they would have passed it or whether they would have gone the right way or the wrong way, we still have to repeal and replace Obamacare. First, it is a law that basically disincentivizes hiring more people. To the extent you hire people, it's a law that encourages you to hire them less than full-time. Second, there's a lot of people in this country that believe they're covered, and they'll find out soon enough when, unfortunately, they were to get sick, that they're not. Because they have very high, first of all, the provider networks are very limited, especially if it's a specialty. You may find that the nearest specialist is nowhere in sight. You can't even access it. Second, you're going to find you have extraordinarily high co-payments. When you go in, you're going to have to pay $100, $200, $300 that you don't have just to use your insurance. And third, you're going to find out you have a huge deductible. So we're already hearing stories of people that are going into hospitals and then they're handed a bill and they're like, why am I getting a bill? I have Obamacare. And they say, yeah, you also have a $4,000 or $6,000 deductible. And unless you can pay that, you don't really have health care. That's complicated. And the fourth is, there are an increasing number of doctors that are saying, we're not going to take these plans. We don't want to be part of that network because there's a deductible and a copayment. Before we get paid, you got to get through the deductible and the copayment. And if the deductible is $4,000 and your procedure is only $2,000, I'm going to have to get the money from the patient. I know my patients don't have it, and I can't be providing free care for everyone. So it's also going to discourage more people from going into medicine, but also it's going to really narrow these provider networks and hurt the quality of the care. So what's a better approach? Here's a better approach. A better approach is to say, we're going to put every individual American in charge of their own health insurance decisions. Whether it's your employer that gives you the money pre-tax, whether it's your own money pre-tax, or whether it's a tax credit, you will be able to use that money to buy health insurance of the kind you want, not the kind the government tells you you need, the kind of insurance you want from any company in any state in America that's willing to sell it to you. And now you're going to have millions of Americans in charge of healthcare dollars, and the private sector is going to respond to that by creating better products with better prices. They're going to compete with each other for your business, the way they compete now for your auto insurance business, the way they compete now with all sorts of other decisions that you control. That is a much better way of insuring Americans than this process, that in addition to leaving a lot of people technically uninsured or practically uninsured, is discouraging job creation and encouraging people not to hire more people.
Now, the president's reminded us that Obamacare is the law of the land. I'm sure he's going to remind us that again. And there's going to be politicians throughout this presidential cycle who will talk about repeal and replace. Are there some short-term things that we can do legislatively to help the American people with health care? Whether it's like medical device tax, 40-hour work week, what are some short-term
Yeah, I mean, these are all, I think the important thing is not to lose sight that we're not looking to fix a law that can't be fixed. Obviously, I think if there's an opportunity to help the American people along the way or help our economy, we should always explore that. But what's really important is for us to not fall into this trap of saying, okay, Obamacare is the law of the land, so now let's just try to fix it and make it work better. Ultimately, I think holistically, its approach is bad for our economy and ultimately bad for people as well. I think especially when there's a better approach out there. What I do think is that those of us who are opposed to Obamacare recognize, yes, there is a health insurance problem in America, but the way to solve it was not to disrupt health insurance for 100% of the people in this country. The way to solve it would have been to leave the 70% that were happy with what they had, and then focus on the other 20 or 30% that didn't have good coverage and provide them more options in the private market and in the private sector. And so it's important for us to prove that what we're arguing here is not we're going to go back to the way things were. We're going to actually create an alternative that's better for our economy and better for them as well. And so that's an important, but we can't lose sight and accept this notion that it's here to stay. It doesn't have to be here to stay. But we do have to create a compelling alternative that Americans understand is better than what we have right now.
Americans for Prosperity is a very effective grassroots organization. We've got several people here in Manchester that helped us with special elections here in the springtime, knocking doors and making phone calls. And we really pride ourselves in citizen lobbying. And tell me, as a state legislator and also the United States Senator, what has been some of the most effective ways for everyday people to lobby their legislator?
Let me back up for a moment. When I became the Speaker of the Florida House, my colleagues chose me to be Speaker of the Florida House in 2004, going into 2005. I challenged my colleagues. I said, you know, a lot of what we do here in Tallahassee, the state capital of Florida, is largely driven by what we read in the newspaper or what someone hires a lobbyist to come talk to us about. And obviously there are issues we're going to have to deal with, you know, the fight between the optometrists and the ophthalmologists, the fight between the concrete industry and the asphalt industry, you know, all those sorts of things. But why don't we go out and engage people in a conversation? Why don't we go out and ask people, what would you do if you were in our position? And we did that all across the state. The first answer was resign, but the second, we actually collected ideas from people from all over Florida. It was a project called 100 Innovative Ideas for Florida's Future. We picked 100 of the best ideas of all the ideas we collected. We actually published it in a book. We went out and passed that agenda. All 100 of those things passed out of the Florida House. Over half of them today are either the law or the policy of the state of Florida. All of it driven by engaging people. And that was before we had social media and all. It's funny to say it was only 7 years ago, but before we had all of that ability to communicate with people directly. Here's the second point, and believe me when I tell you this. This was true in the state legislature and it's true in the Senate. Nothing gets the attention of an elected official quicker than the number of phone calls on an issue or the number of emails that they're getting. I know every Friday I get a report from my office, and it's a matrix of the top 10 calls that we got. People, you know, 500 people called about this, 600 people called about that. Now look, sometimes you just don't agree with them. It's a matter of principle. And oftentimes they're organized by a special interest or somebody else that did it. But believe me, if an issue's popping up in the phone calls or in the emails or in the letters, your elected official, for the most part, are going to pay attention to it. It's extremely effective when people know that the folks back home are paying attention and care about something. And to the extent that organizations like AFP or others could channel people towards taking that sort of action, I believe it actually does have a great impact on what your elected leaders focus on, and in many instances what they do about it.
You know, one of the key things that we want to accomplish tonight is for these activists to learn more about the Export-Import Bank, to learn more about these issues, and to be able to take that back home. So when you go to your district office visits and you talk to your legislator and their staff, that you can make a huge impact. It's good to know that you guys hear the phone calls, you see the visits.
Absolutely.
You know, with the XM Bank, I'll just go back there for a little bit because that was an issue that nobody really knew about. And how did you see the grassroots affect this? Because it seemed like it was just entrenched by the lobbyists, an issue that not too many people knew. What was the grassroots impact on the XM?
It just started popping up in the questions people would ask and the emails that we were getting and the phone calls that were coming into our office. And in the product being produced by organizations like yourself and Heritage and others. And you begin to learn more about what it means and what the program looks like. Look, Florida is a huge beneficiary. I think we are the second largest beneficiary of XM Bank loans in the country. And yet, I fundamentally understand that when you look at the guts of the argument, they don't hold water. I believe the number is 97% of American exports happen outside of the XM Bank, so this notion that it's critical is not true. I think the statistics are about 73/4 of the loans go to a handful of companies. And so you start to realize what you really have here is a government-funded program that allows not just money to flow to those who are politically connected, but in fact money to flow overseas. to Russia, to projects in China, to projects in other parts of the world, when in fact there already exists all sorts of non-governmental ways to fund a lot of these projects and programs that do not require us to be committed to an agency of this nature and of this size, that becomes self-perpetuating, that builds around itself its own interests that lobby for its very existence. They become untouchable. So I first learned about it, or started hearing a lot about it, about 2.5 years ago, as individual activists began to call our office and email us and bring it up as we engaged in town halls or in other discussions. And again, I suspect that a lot of that was driven by the information being put out there by AFP and other groups.
My last question for you is, you've been traveling the country, and one of the things that Americans for Prosperity wants to accomplish is to bring more well-being to people's lives. To really help families and individuals experience well-being by instituting solid policies. When you're going across the country and talking with people, what's a key theme that you're hearing?
Well, I think the best word I can use is uncertainty. Even people that are doing well, right? Even someone who's making enough money and is happy is very uncertain about the future. They're worried about their children. They open the newspapers every day or watch the news, and yet another horrible thing has happened somewhere in the world where Islamic jihadists have beheaded a group of Christians, or they've taken over a city that was once liberated at the price of American lives, or China's building another island in the South China Sea, or Russia's done something else, or there's been a cyber attack that's stolen the privacy information of 18 million Americans, and so forth. So there's concern about that, and this notion that somehow America is no longer able to influence global events the way it once did. And then at home, you feel like this economy is so different than the one we lived in just 10 or 15 years ago. And the old ways of doing things don't seem to work as well as they once did. But no one's figured out what the new way of doing things used to be. And the only answer these guys have for us is, well, we're going to create another government program. Or we're going, the reason why things aren't going well for you is because someone else is making too much money. So let's go raise taxes on them. And yet none of that's worked either. In fact, you have record numbers of people that have dropped out of the labor force. Record numbers of people now stuck on government assistance. And so I think there's a real opportunity to go to people and explain to them what's happening. What's happening is the world is changing faster than the Industrial Revolution. This is as disruptive as the Industrial Revolution because, in fact, more so, it's happening every 5 years, not over the period of 100 years. We are engaged in global competition. So when we debate taxes and regulations, it's no longer an ideological debate. It's the fundamental question now is, does it make it competitive? Does it make us competitive or not? When you talk about government programs or expanding the size of our debt, the fundamental question is no longer what the proper role of government is. It goes deeper than that. Will it actually help make America a better place for better paying jobs to be created? So I think we do have an opportunity because it is clear that this big government expansion has not worked. In fact, people today are not better off than they were a few years ago, and in many respects are worse off and falling even further behind. And that real frustration that you have millions of hardworking Americans, some of whom have had the same job for 20 years, but 20 years ago, that job paid enough to save for retirement, to send their kids to college. Now they live paycheck to paycheck because everything costs more, but their paychecks have not kept pace. And again, the reason is because we have created anti-competitive policies that have kept America from fulfilling its potential. Look, we're still the best place in the world, okay? There's no other country I would trade places with. I wouldn't rather be China. I wouldn't rather be Brazil, India, Russia, you name it. There's no country in the world I look at and say, I wish we were that. What bothers me is that we have so much potential. We can be even better than we've ever been in the 21st century. But we're being held back by these outdated ideas pronounced by outdated leaders. And these bad ideas, they were bad in the 20th century. They are disastrous in the 21st century because we have more competition than ever. I think we have a real opportunity to tackle this.
Senator Rubio, I want to thank you on behalf of Americans for Prosperity. You're one of our greatest champions in the United States Senate for a whole host of issues, but especially for taking the lead on the Export-Import Bank, which is a very relevant issue and very timely. I also want to thank everybody here in Manchester for everything that you do for AFP and everything you do for your community. And for all of our activists all across the world that are watching on our live stream, be sure to go back to roadtoreform.org. We look forward to coming back to Manchester and some other early states to talk about these policies that will help put this economy back on track. So thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much.